Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Discussing a Murder. This is Jeff Jones with me today again with a full panel. We'll go from the top and welcome Kellie first and say, hello, Kellie, how are you doing today?
Good morning. I'm very well. It's good to be back as always, and welcome panel and everyone in chat.
Thank you. And Big Jeff, welcome back.
Thank you, Jeff. I don't know where the time goes. It just seems just like yesterday that we were here in the last episode, but here we are again to continue to tear apart the state's case. It's good to be here, and I know we're going to start off with the blood. And a bold prediction would be that this is going to be the shortest amount of episode that we've ever gotten through for 1 hour. That's my bold prediction for today.
That is a bold prediction. I don't know. I think we should steal that, and maybe we can make this a regular thing. Big Jeff's bold predictions. I like that. Dr. Silkman, do you have any bold predictions for today, or just welcome and say hi?
First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much, Jeff, and hi to my fellow panel members and everyone in chat. It's great to be back to continue our episode here, and I think Kellie and I have to have our microphones muted from now on, or we'll never finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Silkman, and last but certainly not least, welcome back, Jack.
Thanks, Jeff, and hello to my panel members and the live chat. It's good to be back. Had a great discussion last episode with the forensics and, of course, Brendan, and looking forward to some more good discussion. Let's do it.
The flakes are back under here. You can't see it in this picture. It's like between the console and the edge of the seat is where she's finding them. So
that doesn't make any sense. I mean, if they're flakes, there's got to be a source of those flakes.
Yeah, because she is not saying there was a stain, and that's highly suspicious.
I find it unusual, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that's preposterous. So, okay, so then let's talk about this blood, which it looks like it's flowing down. What is that?
Appears to me to be a angular passive drip stain.
That just ran down like gravity?
Well, yeah, I mean, actually, I've got some really good high-speed videos that show how this is formed. The blood drop actually, it hits the surface here, and then it just kind of runs down like this and then finally stops. But that's pretty much what we're seeing there.
Let me ask you this. If you got into the trailer and the blood was in the sink, could you have picked a drop up if you had this? Because I'm trying to think the removal to the drop, because swabbing, you're not going to create a drop.
Sorry to displace you again here.
Yeah, here, let's see.
Well, here.
So let's see if,
I'm sure you can.
Oh, that would be the better way to do it.
If it's still wet, it's got to still be wet.
Yeah,
obviously.
but they got in when it was wet, so that's how you pull it up.
Well, here, okay, I pulled some blood up from there.
Yeah.
And let's see what we do here.
Yeah.
You're going to get pretty much the same thing. I haven't got the same amount there.
Yeah.
It looks just like the one there.
It
In
does.
fact, I think the bottom of that's probably been cut off. But anyway, that looks pretty much like what you're seeing there, right?
It does.
You agree?
Yep, I agree. So now I know that's how it's pulling up with the dropper diagram. As Stephen Avery described, dripping on the edge of the sink, and then
The blood should eventually, fragment after you'll see cracks in the surface, et cetera. And we're waiting to see when that will occur.
all right.
All right.
Okay.
You ready for the scraping episode?
Yeah. Oh, those are good size.
And this one?
Yep.
Let's try. This might be a little
Okay.
moist, but yeah, it's all
Yeah,
right.
it still broke up. I think that non-absorbent surface really. Great.
You got quite a few in there
Yeah,
now.
you got a bunch of them. Look at that.
I think that's a really nice demonstration there, showing what happens when blood is on a non-absorbent surface. When it desiccates, it dries out and will form that flake-like structure. But I don't think anyone here or in chat would seriously think that a planter is going to be planting flakes, right? You're not going to do anything crazy like that. So it still really begs the question, and I think it's a big one. Where did those flakes actually come from? To me, the most obvious thing is that Culhane, Groffey, or whoever was Erdl, whoever was in that RAV4, must have missed a spot or spots on a hard surface of the RAV where the blood had dried out and it simply popped off and formed a flake. I can't buy the argument that a planter is going to be planting blood flakes. That doesn't make any sense at all.
I have to agree, Dr. Silkman, and this is going back on the last podcast we did where we kind of stopped off here, and when we played on a little bit more of the video as we start here, you hear what they say is exactly what I said in the previous one, and that was it has to be still wet. When they came in, it had to have been still wet, and this is why I was explaining about the 5 stages of the cycle of blood coagulation until you get to the dried flake stage. So, as we see, it took 90 minutes to get to what Kathleen needed to be able to obtain them flakes. I truly, at this stage, will not accept, but I completely understand that I don't think a planter like you, Dr. Silkman, is taking flakes. That's just such an irrational thought decision that you would think, oh, I need flakes. Unless, of course, you took them because you thought you were able to maybe rehydrate them because you needed more blood. That's always a possibility. But again, it just seems like a bit of a stretch, like a little bit, you need a little bit more, and you shouldn't need more. It should be more straightforward. And I think that it was most likely it come from a drip that was missed and it just flaked off, and that's how we get the flakes.
Would the flakes themselves, when we talked about the difficulty in, sort of cleaning the blood out of another surface, right? If it was in something, you'd have to use the distilled water, the hot distilled water, and that would be good. But if you had a blood flake, as opposed to having to clean it out of something, isn't that a better, almost like an Alka-Seltzer? You just you just drop it into something, and all of a sudden, as long as you have the right amount of liquid, even if it's tap water, do you have something?
The
That's
problem
my
with
question
that,
to you guys.
yeah, the problem with that, Big Jeff, is that you now have another step that you have to do, right? If you're a planter, the less handling, I'm not sure what Kellie thinks, but if you're a planter, the less handling of something, the better. Because remember, whenever you go into a vehicle or you go into a scene, there's always the danger of you leaving a trace of yourself. So the less you handle blood flakes, etc., the better it is. Yes, I do agree with you, Big Jeff. Having blood flakes gives you that potential option for storage and using later on, but it still comes down to the same basic question: where did the blood come from, right? Whether it's in liquid form, whether it's in flake form. If you look at the RAV4, you see both types of blood. You see, obviously, liquefied blood that got dripped onto a surface, and you see desiccated blood in the form of a flake. So if it's all Stephen Avery's blood, it ultimately had to come from a source. And the argument here is, where did that blood actually ultimately come from? Did it come from Stephen's bleeding finger? Did it come from the sink? Or did it come from his Pontiac Grand Am, right? Or his trailer? So they're all the blood that I can think of that has exactly the same methylation age, right? So you know that you can exclude the blood vial. The DNA methylation analysis proved that the DNA is not from 1996. It's from someone closer to 2005. So it begs the question, what is the ultimate source of that blood?
Yeah. And the other thing is, and I hate to say it because it guts me every time, this is why I was so favorable for the vial when it all first came out. I watched Making a Murderer and I was like, yeah, that's it. And when I started doing this experiments, I was so like, this has to be it, because with the vial, you can have it all. As you've seen, Big Jeff, I think we were on a video once and I was showing you, but with the vial, when I untwisted the lid and popped it off, flakes dropped from the lid. And so I had it all. I had the liquefied that I needed and I had the flakes. And I didn't even realize that I had flaked until someone pointed it out looking down, went, what's that on the counter? And I'm like, oh my God, flakes. I didn't even realize it had fallen off when I popped the lid. So that's why I hung on to the vial and tried to explore it as much as I could, because I really thought there could be something into it because it had everything we need. However, like Dr. Silkman said, I can't deny now this methylation testing. I try to, but when it comes to the fabric seat covers and you have 2 drips of Stephen Avery's blood that's fresh, that does not have EDTA in it, you have to let the vial go. And it devastated me because I was like, it leaves me back to the beginning because I don't know.
And again, how long are the flakes going to be flakeable? I mean, if they had left that blood on that sink for a week, is it going to come back and flake off easy, or is it going to completely dry up into something that you can't even? Yeah.
Well, good question. I've still got my hard surface for when I did all my experiments, and I still have, disgustingly enough to admit, but I've still got a blood drip on it from last year, middle of last year, and it's still in crustation form. However, it's EDTA blood. The same side, on the other side of that, where the fresh blood was, gone. It's just dropped off and flaked off over the last how many months it is, and I don't know where it is, but the EDTA blood is still in drip format, but in crustation. I'm happy to take a photo of it right now and send it to Jeff Jones. Yeah, it's still there.
I think we can, as much as it pains me to say it, I think we can effectively eliminate EDTA blood. It's definitely not from 1996. The blood is definitely more fresh. There doesn't appear to be any presence of EDTA. And like I said, we have to, and Kathleen Zornick especially, has to come up with a novel method or way on how that blood got into the RAV. Now, the guilters will say, well, yeah, it got into the RAV because Stephen bled. But that doesn't make any sense at all, because if Stephen was actively bleeding, one would find blood essentially everywhere in that RAV4. And when you think and consider that according to Brendan Dassey and the state, Stephen and Brendan drove the RAV4 to the pit area, it means that you have to handle the RAV4. You have to handle the gear shift. You have to handle the steering wheel, etc., etc. You don't find any distribution of blood. And, you know, the crazy thing is, had they luminol tested it, they could have determined, oh, look, there are trace amounts of blood on the wheel, steering wheel. There are trace amounts of blood on the gear shift. Yeah, no problems. This car was driven. They never tested that. But what I really don't understand is the fact that you have no mixture of blood, right? So if Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey had viciously attacked Teresa Halbach and the fact that Stephen had opened up his cut, why is it that you find no mixture of blood, and you don't find Stephen's blood in the back of the RAV? His blood tends to be at the front. Teresa Horbach's blood tends to be mainly in the back area. So the blood evidence is damning, I admit, but it doesn't make any sense. Further, and my final point is this, that blood drop on the back passenger side rear door panel, that's a solid drop of blood, right? And Kellie will back me up on this. That is a solid drop of blood, which means that, hey, if Stephen was actively bleeding, one would have expected more of those type of droplets of blood everywhere. Drip, drip, drip. You don't find that.
It is a solid drip of blood, and it also is that solid that it doesn't show any forms of any coagulation like starting. So when it was dripped, it was literally in its prime liquid form, like almost. This is why everyone assumes in terms of narrative and timeline, it would have had to have happened really quick, because there doesn't have any kind of it forms like these little coagulated crystal in the blood. We can see it's like almost like grains of sand sometimes as it starts to formulate into that, that's first initial stage. And this doesn't, it's just clear liquid. And that's why, again, it appears to be very fresh. I completely get what Silkman said in terms of, it doesn't make any sense if he's dripping, where's all the rest of the stuff? It doesn't. And I think that's why I hang on to the case, because it just something doesn't seem right. It's just something's not there. But it's more so, and like we keep saying, it's what you can prove to the courts for them to take it serious as well. The ultimate question is, in as we stand right now, has Kathleen provided anything more than just a narrative of how it could be Stephen's blood and fresh? Now, I'm not trying to say let's turn it against Kathleen and say she's not doing her job, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm just trying to say, for the courts to review it, is there anything that she has been able to show beyond that it's just fresh blood of where and how it got there? Because ultimately that will be what helps them make their decision.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is no, Cal, unfortunately. And if you just rewind, if we just rewind back a few episodes, when Kathleen Zellner lays out her strategy, the first part of her strategy is to show that Stephen's constitutional rights were violated. And to do that, she needs a Brady or a Denny. And that's why she's been so focused very hard on Bobby. When I'm talking with my friends on Discord, I tell them I don't believe that she actually thinks that Bobby did it, but she just has to frame this narrative. I also believe that she doesn't believe Stephen did it, the same way that the people on this panel don't believe that Stephen did it. But she's painted into a corner, I think. And those things that you talk about, that evidence of which you speak, there simply does not exist, and it's not going to exist, which is why she's so desperate for a constitutional violation. And so she's tried to paint that picture with Bobby. I used to think Bobby was a reasonable suspect. I don't think that anymore. I have my idea who I think did it, and maybe that's for another podcast as well. But the type of evidence of which you speak, it's almost like trying to prove a negative, right? It's logically impossible to prove a negative, and but what you're asking for, I don't think is going to happen, and that's why I fear many of her. Other than solving the case with conclusive evidence, I just don't think that evidence. But what form would it take? I just don't see. That's why your question is so hard and so good. It's a tough one to swallow.
Something so it can be seen.
I will. Yeah, I'll take.
All right.
All right, now what we should do is what we did. We can swab up.
Do you want this swab to go
Yeah, these swabs we're going to do by the ignition. The officers that are suspected in that activity were evidence techs who carried swabs and distilled water.
Now let's see what I got here. Here we go.
Oh, wow.
How's that?
Great.
Whoop, there it is. Here, Kathleen, distilled water. Even she knows the method. So she's obviously, I don't know whether if it's just common practice knowledge for her or whether she was like explained to about it by her experts, but she brings up the distilled water. For an average person like me, you, in general, I personally, when I first done the experiments, dumbass me, use normal water. And it wasn't until I went back and started reading and doing more research that I realized, no, you need distilled. It has to be distilled. So that's what I mean. Unless you're walking around with all these tools and skills and the ability to see the future that Stephen was going to even bleed, I find it really hard to think that someone saw an opportunity on the spot and was able to cash that in and take it to their advantage as quick as they would have had to, and as skilled as they would have had to have been, just to know the basics of physics and what you need to do.
I mean, in my mind, I mean, Jeff put an interesting question or an interesting comment in our internal chat. If you don't mind, if you want to just say it, Jeff, instead of having us read it, because I think it's very interesting, and I'd like to respond to it.
The comment that I just put in our private chat?
Yeah, put it.
Well, I'm starting to lean towards the idea, the planting scenario, when they put the tarp over the RAV4 for 45 minutes with no real reason, because it's a car, and it's not like they identified and they said, here's blood evidence we have to protect. It's a car, let's put the tarp on it. I just think my mind goes there, that here's an opportunity where they tarped it off. If one guy opens a door and slips in and drops some, we don't know why did they tarp it then? And that's kind of where my head goes, because what's the purpose of the tarp?
Yeah, I hear you, but I think it's worse than that. I completely respect that opinion. But who was it Erdl who showed up to take pictures in the morning? So they bring the RAV back to the crime lab that night. They go in to take pictures of the who on Sunday, yes. And who was it?
Erdl.
Erdl. It was Erdl. And what does he show up to? An unlocked door, right? They had to do all these. You read all of Henbury's posts, right? And they had to do all this wonky stuff because the RAV4 was locked. They had to get under the car and drop the drive shaft and do all sorts of stuff because the car was locked. They didn't have a way in to the car, so they had to get it out of the box. They had to get into the box a funny way. They had to get out of the box a funny way. But Erdl shows up in the morning, Sunday morning, and the damn door's unlocked.
Well, it was actually Groffy.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that correction. But the whole chain of custody is lost at that point, right? I understand why Kathleen is reluctant and she's exonerated the police, because we know damn well that her cases go nowhere if she tries to inculpate the police. But if you really look at who this case against Stephen Avery benefited the most, there is no doubt about who the answer to that is, right? There is no doubt, and the answer is the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office. There's no doubt about that answer. Now, I'm not saying they did it, right? They're saying in my mind that's who this helped the most. This prosecution of Avery, and they had the evidence text. They had all this opportunity to do it, and they needed a whopper for this civil suit to go away. The whopper of all times, and they got it. What a stroke of luck, as Kathleen said. It's just that's the way I feel about
To add to that, and to Jeff's statement about the tarping and what the hell happened, I think about the unfiled search warrant and the blunt and bloody instrument that fell into a black hole, and I have all kinds of weird thoughts about what really happened at the crime lab. Why wasn't there? And I'm not saying that that they necessarily would video everything. I don't know their procedure. As far as when they make entry into a vehicle that belongs to a missing person, and certainly but this time they were neck deep by the 6th or 7th, early morning of the 7th, whenever it was that they got into it and got started on it. And no representative from Calumet or Manitowoc present. There's just the phone call between Harrington and Fassbender on the afternoon of November 6th. I just have a really bad feeling about what happened at that lab. What did they do? If they're going to disappear this whatever object that's got blood on it, it's gone. It wasn't tested. It wasn't fingerprinted. We have nothing. What else would they do? What else were they capable of? How far would they go? Something happened in that stretch of time. And let's just say from the time that, time of God found the ray of sunshine and found the her and Nicole, the cops arrive. At some point, within the next few hours, they tarp it. It stays there all damn day. They finally get her hauled away. I got a bad feeling. I can't prove it. This is all speculation, guys. It's an allegation.
Agreed, yep.
Right? So, it's just all kinds of weird shit in my brain. Can't explain. I can't prove any of it, but boy, it sure does look bad. It really looks sketchy as shit.
Yeah, I agree, Jack 61. But there's a couple of big problems, and that is that if you're a planter, you absolutely have to be 100% sure that the biological material that you plant comes from the person that you set up. The problem with the blood in the sink, especially found on November the 5th, because remember the Colburn and other detectives were in Stephen Avery's trailer, and they did note blood and they did some swabbings. The problem is they didn't know whose blood that was. If you're looking for a missing person, potentially it could have been Teresa Horbach's blood for all they knew. So the planter, if this was a planting scenario, had to have known the material that was planted came exclusively from Stephen and nobody else. So we know that Chuck Avery knew that his brother had bled because Stephen went to Menards with Chuck. But then the question has to be asked is, would Chuck be savvy enough to obtain blood from Stephen without Stephen noticing and then planting in the RAV4? I highly, highly doubt it. So to me, that leaves a window of opportunity for planting when that RAV4 got to the crime lab, as Jack 61 said. So there's a window there. The moment that RAV4 is off the property and there are no eyes on it, i.e. a video camera or people taking photographs, you've got an opportunity to open up the RAV and seed it with blood. But here's the ultimate question. Who had access to Stephen's genomic DNA? There's one person that I know of, and that is a sample from 2003, right? That's Cherie Cohane. And that came from item W, which was a buccal swab. Now, Cherie Cohane would have prepared genomic DNA because she had to as part of Stephen Avery's exoneration. If you do a DNA methylation on that DNA, it's going to come back to pretty close to 2005, right? Rather than 1996. So the problem for Kathleen Zellner is that she knows that if she points a finger at the crime lab or law enforcement, they'll toss it right out. That's why she is forced in a way to point to Bobby Dassey, because he potentially has or satisfies all three prongs of the Denny, right? She may not believe it. I agree with Big Jeff. She may not believe it at all, but she's been placed in a corner where she's really got no option. And it's funny because what did the state say, guys? They were laughing at Kathleen Zellner. They were saying, hey, wait a minute. This really points to the work of law enforcement because they had control of the RAV4, right? That means that they had an opportunity to plant material, biological material. Cherie Culhane, who did all the swabbing, had in the laboratory Stephen Avery's genomic DNA, which I'm sure she would have had access to. If you produce fake blood, then potentially you can seed the RAV with blood containing Stephen's genomic DNA. No problems at all. When the RAV4, and I'll stop in a second, I promise, when the RAV4 was discovered by Pam God, all the investigators and remember the prosecuting attorneys, the question they asked everyone, did you see blood? Did you find any evidence of blood? And the answer was a resounding no. Now, I understand that the blood could have been very difficult to see, but guys, they were there with torches. And these are seasoned trained detectives. No one had noted the presence of any blood anywhere. And as Jack 61 said, half the CD case had a smear of blood on it. Nobody saw anything. So that's very, very interesting.
So no blood, then a tarp, and then blood? Is that what you said, Dr. Silkman?
Put it this way. The only time that blood was noted was in the crime lab. When the RAV4 got, and Jack 61 is correct, it was Groffy. When he went to the crime lab, he was called early in the morning. He noted that the driver's side door was unlocked. Wait a minute. How can that possibly be? How can it possibly be unlocked? And there's a report, right, Jack 61, they called a locksmith to unlock the RAV4. They probably
right.
used a Slim Jim to unlock it because you need a special code in order to make a duplicate key. And then lo and behold, guys, what does the crime lab actually do? The crime lab actually makes a duplicate key. Now, how do you account for that, guys? Why would the crime lab make a duplicate key when they've already unlocked the vehicle? Any idea?
Not really a reason for it, right?
There's no reason to produce a key, although maybe they needed to have produced the key to explain how they got into the RAV4 in the first place, right? But according to everyone at the salvage site, no one saw the presence of any blood in the RAV4, although people did note items in the RAV4 with Teresa's name on it. They saw the drink bottles, and they would have definitely checked the ignition. Right, guys? Pam of God apparently was a private investigator. She would have checked the ignition to see if there were keys in the ignition, right? She didn't see any stains or anything that looked like blood in the RAV4.
That is that famous seagull-looking blood smear is probably, it's what did Stephen in more than anything, and we don't have an in situ picture of it, and we have just the opposite. We have the investigators telling Mike Hallback, who says it as on a news interview. I'm happy to report that they didn't see any signs of foul play in the car. Right? That's what he says he says it on the news. We have it for all posterity.
That's
so yeah,
correct.
100% agree. 100% correct, Dr. Silk.
Yeah, and it's really remarkable, and Kellie will back me up on this, is that I don't think we have any in situ pictures of inside the RAV4, because quite clearly that butterfly shape is when Culhane and Groffy swabbed the blood stain. Now, what they do is they do put a solution on a cotton tip. They then take a swab from the blood and they do a presumptive test for blood. If the cotton tip turns pink, it means that you have the presence of blood. They then take a fresh cotton tip and they re-swipe the blood stain for DNA preparation. So that means, guys, that the blood near the ignition switch was swabbed 3 times, once by Groffey, twice by Culhane, and hence why that blood pattern is diluted, because they've placed a solution on top of the blood, which means, guys, we don't have an in situ picture of that blood stain. We can't. We cannot have an in situ picture. They took a photograph after they took a swab. Why would you do that?
I would suggest that you do that because the in situ picture would have looked a little bit too much like had a little swab looking thing on it in the first place. That would be my guess, but I don't know because I wasn't there.
I mean, at any rate, though, it's designed to mask what the
Correct.
original stain looked like.
Right,
So,
right.
yeah.
But just the words of Ken Kratz keep on coming back to me. How he used the word, how the shape of that stain was consistent, as if it were some type of fingerprint, and it just reminds me of the Idaho situation again. And I don't know if that's out of bounds to talk about, but the roommate, one of the surviving roommates, described the attacker, the person that she saw, as being 5'10" or taller, athletically built but not muscular, with bushy eyebrows. And they say that the current suspect in custody, Brian Koberger, that description is consistent with Brian, right? So if you think about the use of the word consistent, where Kratz is using it as if it's some type of fingerprint, and that description, which is an accurate utilization of the word consistent, those are two very different utilizations of that word. I mean, so just the evilness of Kratz just gets me going. I'll stop now.
No, you're 100% correct, Big Jeff. I mean, we're doing it now with Reading with the Crew. We're examining the work done by Ken Kratz, and it's completely shocking. And at the end of the day, guys, you know that a prosecuting attorney wants to win the case at all cost. And what is so shocking is that he even gave the impression during the trial that Stephen Avery's cut finger directly touched where the steering column is, with the switch, the ignition switch. And if you follow that argument, someone actually worked it out that Stephen Avery had to be standing on his head upside down to have left that impression from his cut finger, right? And that goes to show the madness of what people can say during a trial. They've got nothing to back it up. But guys, can you see that the damage is done, right? They're trying to say that Stephen's finger directly touched the ignition switch, whereas Kathleen Zellner showed that there is no way that you can touch that ignition area because it's at least 2 inches away from where you put in the key, right? So it's simply crazy.
Seats. And then I want to see up here what, there it is. Could that be true, that it's just that simple? Someone got in the trailer, wiped up the blood, and they dripped it into the car and smeared above the ignition. I think the defense attorneys probably underestimated what they were up against. And I think that the state just has enormous resources. They can bring in all these experts. They can, they have 3 attorneys at the table. They've got all the cops working for them. I mean, you are outgunned when you come into it. But I still believe if you just had a blood spatter expert, I have one case is just on blood spatter. So if you could have definitively taken down one piece of evidence and shown it was planted. It isn't like this would have cost, hundreds of thousands of dollars. You could have gotten the experts, I think, for 20 grand.
She's 100% correct. Blood spatter expert would have made a huge difference, and I'll tell you why. They would have rebuked or rebuffed what the state's own blood spatter expert said about the blood on the back door, right? The spraying of the blood. Ken Kratz was trying to sell to the jury and the judge that Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey picked up Teresa and tossed her in the back of her own RAV, and hence blood from the head wound hit the back door. And Stuart James elegantly showed, and they demonstrated it, that wasn't indeed the case. It was from Teresa Halbach very likely being struck in the head by some type of object. And lo and behold, what do we find in the unserved search warrant? The blunt and bloody object found in the back of the RAV, which is consistent with Teresa Halbach being bludgeoned. So can you imagine during the middle of the trial, the defense team's blood spatter expert doing that demonstration and showing the judge and the jury, I'm sorry, but Teresa Halbach wasn't flung in the back of her RAV and the blood hitting the back door. She was struck and her blood got sprayed on the back door. That totally changes the scenario, right? Because it meant that Teresa Halbach, for all we know, could have been dead right there. If you're struck repeatedly with a blunt object, a heavy blunt object in the skull, not only can that fracture your skull, but it could potentially kill you then and there.
The way Kathleen worded it, she said, if only they had it in the trial. And I agree. I think we've all spoke about this in previous podcasts, that could it have affected the outcome? Because that's essentially what it's about, right? If they had an expert back then, could it have been effective for the jury to understand, at best, create a reasonable doubt? Because that's what you need to be successful, is create that reasonable doubt.
A lot of experts will help you just if you're in that situation. I mean, this was child's play for Stuart James. I mean, he could tell immediately the blood spatter testimony was just completely wrong. It's hard to say that someone's ineffective, but when the state's got 14 experts and you've got 2, there's something dramatically wrong.
Well, people ask us about the verdict and, how we explain it. And I think a lot of it was the pretrial publicity that this particular jury just couldn't put aside. That, and combined with the fact that the ruling shortly before trial that said we weren't going to be able to point the finger at any other suspect and present evidence of that. Unlike a lot of cases, we had other suspects who could very well have done this and tried to present that. And but the court ruled against us by stretching the prior law in a way that made it impossible for us to do that. So, I think that really handicapped us from the beginning.
So just to recap really quickly, these are the people that they were wanting to put through. The first on the list was Scott Tadich. Then it was, now I've gone blank with what's his name, James Kennedy, Andreas Martinez, L. Avery and Robert Fabian, Chuck Avery, and all the Dassey boys, including Brendan.
Basically, people that were at the salvage yard that day. Doesn't it sound like that's the list of people who were present that day?
Yeah, it was basically the ones that they were trying to, when you read the Dean's and Jerry's Denny motion of what they were trying to get through to Willis, they were, because these people all had the 2 prongs guaranteed, the opportunity and the proximity, because they were there on the salvage yard. The ruling came down that the one thing that they all lacked was motive.
We can't forget with the Denny, the third party stuff, this all began in June of 2006 when Kratz went and filed for the third party ruling, and nothing happened for 7 months. When it did happen, that was in January of 2007, which was basically a month prior to trial. So basically for that length of time, the lawyers couldn't do anything, the defense. They couldn't accuse or, really talk about, bringing evidence against anyone else, or I guess even investigating. Their hands were really tied. And we also shouldn't forget, I don't know if it's a huge point, but it kind of is, that I believe it was Fallon that requested an in-camera hearing, which basically means that Willis cleared the courtroom, and it was just the lawyers and a couple of bailiffs and a court reporter, and that was it. No one was allowed in the gallery to listen to the proceedings. So, and I believe Willis said that was the first one he had done in his entire time on the bench. So that was a kind of an interesting side part. Again, I don't know how important that is, but it kind of is, because it, I get the fact that, you don't want to accuse somebody without something. It's not fair to them. It's not even fair to the defendant either, because as Kel has outlined, and we've all talked about, you really got to have means, motive, and opportunity. One more person that didn't get named, and I don't know, I really don't know if Dean and Jerry had the phone call, the voicemails from Teresa's phone, but Alex Quadrini, we can't forget about him. Alex Quadrini called her phone and left a message. I don't remember what day it was on, but it was on her. It was one of the messages. Henbury got all of those, and we can listen to them, which I thought was really interesting, because he is a convicted murderer that had gotten out. So that contact was a little interesting. Again, it probably doesn't mean anything, but hey, there's that potential, right? But it wasn't investigated.
Just seems like had that RAV4 not been found that day, maybe some of these investigations would have continued on. Maybe
it's very possible.
Would have looked.
Yep, that's
but
right.
Everything came to a screeching halt that day.
Once Stephen's DNA got found in that RAV4, it was party over. It's as simple as that. And we mustn't forget that if this was a two-part deal, i.e. the murder itself and the planting, and the two are not related to each other. So in other words, the planter took advantage of the fact that Teresa Horbach was murdered. And as Big Jeff said, you needed a big whopper. You needed something massive in order to stop the civil suit. And I do believe the planting was related to stopping the civil suit, because the planter had a massive motive to put Stephen Avery back in prison. And you look at the timing of all the events, the timing is remarkable. As Stephen Avery was arrested as felon in possession of a weapon one day before Kacerik was going to take the stand, and he was arrested for the murder of Teresa Horbach on, I believe, November the 15th. That's very soon where Vogel was going to take the stand. So it's rather remarkable about timing. So the question is this: would Stephen murder a young woman for no reason at all, only to let the MTSO, Kacerik, and Vogel off the hook for essentially destroying his life and missing out on a massive windfall? That's what we're dealing here. So if it is a two-part deal, a murder and a setting up of Stephen, how on earth is Zellner or anybody else going to prove that? And you can't simply go to a court and say, well, I believe it was a two-part strategy, the murder and the setting up. You'd be laughed at. So clearly what the state are doing here is using legal argument to stonewall Kathleen Zellner continuously. And at the same time, you've got Stephen and Brendan sitting in prison. So I can't see them getting out unless there is a true breakthrough in this case.
It almost seems to me like it sometimes, and I'm not saying this is right, this is pure speculation, so please take it as such. It's almost like at times that this crime was committed by potentially someone that a Kasorik or somebody that was connected that had a lot to lose hired or got them to do through, maybe they were compromised, in some way over his 20 years as a sheriff. He knew a lot of people. I'm sure he was associated with a lot of people and people that weren't very, very nice people. And then from this position of someone doing this act against Teresa, and then that's a separate thing. And then you have the cops come in. They've already got a big hard on and a target on Avery for filing that civil suit. They come in, they do their little shake and bake. I mean, the key, come on, it's a joke. The key is a joke to me. Even Crash realized it was a joke. And the blood is extremely hard to explain, but then we go back to this unfiled warrant that was written by Wiegert. And that these weren't just, dot them down notes. This was a sworn affidavit they were ready to turn in. But the property owner said, no, it's okay. You can search. We'll sign your waiver. That negates the need to get a search warrant. So that doesn't appear. That this doesn't get submitted. We don't hear about this blunt and bloody instrument. Nobody does. I seriously doubt that. Well, I think we would have heard about it if Buting and Strain or even Zellner knew anything about this unfiled warrant. So what I'm saying is, it's like that there's two separate entities. Not they weren't working together, but the end result was it destroyed Avery and any chance for him to get out and assured a conviction. And of course, Brendan gets grabbed by the neck and drug into it.
I just wanted to briefly comment, Jack, on what you just said, because it 100% rings true with me. And just for example, you guys, we have talked extensively about what type of monster Gregory Allen was, right? But yet we know even from the Stephen Avery depositions that well prior to the Penny Bernstein incident, Gregory Allen had been arrested. And Deb Strauss has asked about this in her deposition, and I think as well as what's her name, Monica, how do you say it? Burkhart Brist?
Burkhart Brist. That's right.
Yeah.
Monica Burkhart Brist.
So they start to go into it with her too, right? They say, okay, well, what do you think about this case? And this case where he was arrested, right? And he's essentially he's on the beach and he whips off his clothes and he starts, diddling himself, in front of some people. He's arrested for that. But yet, the district attorney from Manitowoc County somehow finds it in his heart to bust this down from some type of sex crime, which it obviously, well, I think he started grabbing the woman too. We can get the details. But how is it that the district attorney of Manitowoc County decided to bust this case down from, some type of sexual related assault to disturbing the peace or some type of thing? How is that possible?
He downgraded it, but that's not the only time, Jeff.
It happened again. Yeah.
Yes. Vogel downgraded a lot of the things that Gregory Allen did. He downgraded the charges, and the question is why? Why? And so when we start to talk about people that Kasarik might have known, why is the DA busting down these charges on a friggin' monster like Gregory Allen? I bet you Kasarik, and I speculated again. It's just speculation. He knew a lot of people, and why is he getting the DA to bust these charges down? Could it be that he had some type of goon squad? Why? I just can't see any reason. And the busting down of these charges clearly offended. As a woman, Deb Strauss says, as a woman, I'm offended by the reduction of charges in this case. She says that right in the deposition. Why did that happen? This needs to go away.
It is like that Kasarik had a dirty trick squad. People he could call on that he had compromised over the years. And Vogel went along with it,
Speculation, right? it just seems, and it'd been going on for how long, right? The longer he's in power, the more time he has to, build up his army, if you will. The corruption gets more and more endemic. People in Wisconsin are afraid of the cops. They listen to them talk about the cops in the beginning, episodes of Man One. Now we don't trust them. That's the way it is there. I don't live there. I don't know. Well, you live there, Jeff. How do people feel about the cops and what?
I think it's a pretty, with them or against them kind of dynamic there. I really do. I think you kind of toe the line, like the Hallbox. We love the police. Excuse me. We love the police. Or the other side is we think they're corrupt and they use their power in corrupt manner. And I think I was probably more towards the latter belief between those two polar opposites. I do feel that my time in Wisconsin, growing up there, I was I was a teenager and then in my 20s too. So it's like you're kind of at that age where you might be up to some mischief. So I'll factor that in. But I do always feel like a little paranoid that cops are going to pull you over, or give you a hard time, give you a ticket you can't afford. There was always this little kind of in the back of my mind, we would speak like this, like, hey, nice to meet you. I'm from Wausau. And you'd be like, yeah. So how are the cops in Wausau? Like, it was a normal kind of conversation that we would ask. My friend who grew up in the St. Paul, St. Peter area there in Calumet, he would always complain about the Chilton police. Don't even do 5 miles over if you drive through Chilton. You can't even speed 5 miles over. The Chilton police will get you, So, that's a lot of my anecdotal little experiences that I've had there, Big Jeff. But, there's probably people out there who think the complete opposite, and I do have a friend who became law enforcement who is from Calumet, and I think he's a good guy, A lot of good guys. Is it bad guys or bad system? Is it good guys in a bad system? Is it some of all? A little bit of both. I think that's probably where we're at, for me anyway. But it is getting to be at that time that I throw it back to you, Big Jeff. And we'll have to check the record books on this one, because we may have actually used up the smallest amount of video in one podcast, but I'm not sure. You might have to be the judge of that one.
Well, I always like it when my bold predictions come true. I'll see if I can't muster another one for the next for the next podcast. But to me, it is I think this was a really engaging episode. I really loved the conversation. But because the stuff that we're talking about is absolutely 100% pertinent to this case. The blood evidence is absolutely essential to understand, and the prospects for Stephen's exoneration / new trial, we really have to discuss as adults. And it is sometimes when you have an adult conversation with somebody, it means you have to say things that are uncomfortable, that are potential realities, and you might not like the answers that you get. I hope that's not the case. I will continue to work and research, but we are where we are with the case. A lot of the stuff that we're seeing on these Men episodes, as Kellie so excellently pointed out, there's stuff that the Court of Appeals have already ruled on. So that's kind of where we are. Doesn't make them any less true from our perspective, but the burden of what you have to produce to sort of overcome a wrongful conviction is just immense. And just so we as a society have to ask ourselves, what type of place do you want to live in? What type of country do you want to live in? Is it one where it's so easy to keep the wrongfully convicted, or do you want to give people a fair shot? We want to put monsters away, but that's not what we're doing, I don't think. So anyway, that's where I sit after today, and on to the next.
Thank you, Big Jeff. Tremendous opening, closing arguments, Big Jeff. Dr. Silkman, if you wouldn't give us your take for today. Thank you.
You mean we've actually started the podcast? No. Look, I just want to say my favorite part of the podcast is when Big Jeff gives these big summaries at the end. I really love those. I really love those summaries. Yeah, look, I think the point I want to make here is that we should definitely devote the time, energy, and effort talking about the forensic evidence, the damning forensic evidence, and to see if we can explain it away, logically explain it away. And I do agree with Big Jeff. It is extremely frustrating from Stephen Avery's perspective. Same with Brendan. The state is doing everything in their power to protect the verdicts, and you have an extremely high burden that you must meet before you can even get a new trial. I understand why the state want to do it, but I believe in this particular case with Stephen and with Brendan, they're wrong. I hope that Kathleen Zellner can poke holes in the state's narrative and get Stephen an evidentiary hearing. But yeah, I'm really enjoying the podcast and great to be here, and say hi to everybody and bye to everyone in chat. Thank you.
Well, we sure enjoy having you here, Dr. Silkman, and your input. Priceless for us, and thank you for that input. Moving on to Jack. Jack, give us your closing arguments, let's say.
Closing arguments. Yeah, it was a really interesting conversation. We got into a lot of different areas of the case, and as everyone knows, I like to understand. And I call it mechanically. That's probably the wrong word. That's just how I look at it, because I was a shade tree mechanic for a good part of my life. Worked on various things, but I like to understand the process of how things work, and boiling this down to its finer points of what really occurred, what really happened. The last episode we talked a lot about the blood and how did that work? How did this work inside the RAV? What really happened? And then we moved on to this episode. We've talked again about the blunt and bloody instrument and its complete disappearance. We hear about it one time, basically, and it's done. Not fingerprinted, no testing, nothing. It's just gone. So I'm left to, and many of us, I guess, that if you want to talk about, even think about this unfiled warrant, what really happened? What did they really find? And what I'll bring up again. Why wasn't it videoed? Why wasn't someone there to memorialize when the door was opened? I have, it leads into this kind of thing when you hear Ken Kratz talk about the key at the end of the trial and trying to get that separated out. So they had these elements that were put in and then yanked back out. They took it out. The jury didn't get to hear about it. Anyway, I'm not going to go on about that. Great discussion. And it very well just a prediction. Just a prediction very well may be true. We didn't get through very much of the episode. So anyway,
like that. We're adding segments anyway, Jack.
That's right. Anyway, great discussion, and on to the next.
On to the next. Yeah, I think we're creating new segments. We got bold predictions now. We got wrap-up comments. We got closing arguments. It's the name of the game. It just gets more complex as we go along. But Kel, you have the honor and the responsibility of leading us out of episode 21. So the floor is yours.
That was very interesting. Again, we didn't get through much, but as always, we jam-pack a lot in there. I love talking about the stuff that I got to personally experience, and that's like the experiments and the blood and the forensic in the case. Thank you for allowing me to share some of the things I've learned in the case, for the feedback we get, and yeah, on to the next. And here's to Stephen and Brendan's future release, hopefully.
Oh, thank you, Kel. I couldn't have said it better myself. So, for Jack and Dr. Silkman, Big Jeff, and Kel, this is Jeff Jones saying this has been Discussing a Murderer.